I still remember that Tuesday morning like it was yesterday. I was sitting at my desk at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm in downtown Chicago, when my manager called me into her office. I'd been working there for almost 8 years, grinding through tax seasons, client meetings, and endless spreadsheets. I thought I was doing well. I thought I had a future there. But when Margaret closed the door behind me and asked me to sit down, I knew something was terribly wrong. Her face had that look, you know the one I mean. That carefully practiced expression of fake sympathy that managers wear when they're about to ruin your day. "Christopher," she said, folding her hands on her desk, "we've had to make some difficult decisions about restructuring the department." I felt my stomach drop. Restructuring. That word always meant one thing. She went on about budget cuts and shifting priorities and how it wasn't personal, but I barely heard any of it. All I could think about was my rent, my car payment, my student loans. At 34 years old, I was starting over. Just like that, with one conversation, my entire life felt like it was falling apart. She handed me a folder with my severance package, 2 months' salary and health insurance until the end of the quarter. 2 months. That was supposed to make everything okay. I walked out of that office in a daze. My co-workers avoided eye contact as I packed up my desk. 8 years of my life fit into one cardboard box. Photos, a coffee mug my niece had given me, a few books, some office supplies I'd bought myself. That was it. That was all I had to show for nearly a decade of loyalty to a company that could toss me aside without a second thought. I drove home in silence, not even turning on the radio. My apartment felt smaller somehow when I walked in at 11 in the morning, a time I was never usually home. I set the box down on my kitchen table and just stood there staring at it, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. The next few days were a blur of job applications and rejection emails. Apparently, being unemployed in your mid-30s with nothing but accounting experience in a saturated market wasn't exactly appealing to potential employers. I started avoiding calls from my mum because I couldn't bear to hear the disappointment in her voice when I told her I still hadn't found anything. My savings were dwindling faster than I'd expected. Turns out, even when you're being careful, money has a way of disappearing when there's nothing coming in to replace it. I was 3 weeks into unemployment when I got the letter that changed everything. It came in a thick manila envelope with a return address from a law firm in Asheville, North Carolina. I almost threw it away, thinking it was some kind of scam or junk mail, but something made me open it. Inside was a letter on expensive letterhead from Henderson & Price, attorneys at law. "Dear Mr. Christopher Jefferson," it began, "we are writing to inform you of an inheritance left to you by your late great-uncle, Theodore Jefferson, who passed away on October 3rd of this year." I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. Great-uncle Theodore. I barely remembered him. He was my grandmother's brother, a man I'd met maybe twice in my entire life at family reunions when I was a kid. He was quiet, kept to himself, and from what I remembered, he'd moved away from the family decades ago to live somewhere in the mountains. The letter went on to explain that Theodore had owned a farm property in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 40 minutes outside of Asheville, and that he'd left it to me in his will. There were no other living relatives on that side of the family, apparently, and for reasons the lawyer didn't explain, Theodore had specifically named me as his heir. The property consisted of approximately 78 acres of land, a farmhouse, a barn, and several outbuildings. However, the letter cautioned, the property had been abandoned for the last 15 years and was in significant disrepair. If I wanted to claim the inheritance, I needed to contact the law firm within 60 days and travel to North Carolina to sign the necessary paperwork and inspect the property. I sat there holding that letter for what felt like hours. A farm, in the mountains, an entire property that was apparently mine if I wanted it. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. I'd never farmed a day in my life. I didn't know the first thing about agriculture or livestock or any of that, but I also didn't have anything keeping me in Chicago anymore. No job, no girlfriend, no real ties except for my mom and sister, and they'd understand. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe this was the universe telling me it was time for a change, or maybe I was just desperate enough to see meaning in random coincidence. Either way, I made a decision that night. I called the law firm the next morning and told them I'd be there by the end of the week. The drive from Chicago to Asheville took me about 11 hours, straight through with only stops for gas and coffee. I wanted to get there, see this place, and figure out what I was dealing with. The lawyer, a friendly woman in her 50s named Patricia Henderson, met me at her office on a Friday afternoon. She had me sign a mountain of paperwork. explained the property taxes I'd now be responsible for, which thankfully weren't too high given the rural location and current condition, and handed me a set of keys that looked like they were older than I was. She also gave me directions to the property and warned me, with genuine concern in her eyes, that I should prepare myself. "The place hasn't been lived in for a very long time, Christopher," she said. "Your great-uncle moved into a nursing facility in town about 15 years ago, and the property has just been sitting there ever since. It's going to need a lot of work." I followed Patricia's directions out of Asheville, winding through increasingly narrow mountain roads as the autumn afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky. The GPS on my phone lost signal about 20 minutes into the drive, so I was relying on the handwritten directions she'd given me. Turn left at the old gas station, right at the fork where the big oak tree stands. Continue for 3 miles until you see a rusted mailbox with the number 47. The scenery was beautiful, I'll give it that. Rolling mountains covered in trees that were just starting to turn orange and red, the kind of landscape you see on postcards. But as I drove deeper into these isolated hills, I started to wonder what the hell I'd gotten myself into. When I finally found the mailbox, barely visible under a tangle of vines and weeds, I turned onto what I guess you could call a driveway. It was more like 2 dirt ruts with grass growing down the middle, and my sedan scraped bottom more than once as I navigated the bumpy, overgrown path. The driveway curved through a thick stand of trees and then suddenly opened up into a clearing. And there it was, my inheritance. My stomach sank. The farmhouse stood in the middle of the property, a 2-story structure that might have been charming once upon a time, but now looked like something out of a horror movie. The white paint had long since peeled away, leaving bare grey wood exposed to the elements. Several windows were broken, covered haphazardly with boards that had themselves begun to rot. The front porch sagged dangerously to one side, and I could see from where I sat in my car that part of the roof had caved in on the left side of the house. The barn wasn't in much better shape. It leaned at an angle that seemed to defy physics. Its red paint faded to a dull rust color, and the doors hung open on broken hinges. There were other structures scattered around, what might have been a chicken coop, a storage shed, something that looked like it could have been a workshop, all in various states of decay. Weeds had taken over everything. What might have once been a garden or yard was now waist-high grass and wild shrubs. A rusted tractor sat abandoned near the barn, weeds growing up through its engine compartment. This wasn't just a fixer-upper. This was a disaster. This was 78 acres of overwhelming responsibility that I had no idea how to handle. I sat in my car for a good 10 minutes, just staring at the scene in front of me, trying to decide whether to laugh or cry. I'd driven 11 hours to claim an inheritance that looked like it would cost more to fix than it could possibly be worth. But I'd also driven 11 hours, paid for a hotel room in Asheville, and didn't have anything to go back to in Chicago except an apartment I could barely afford and a dead-end job search. So I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and got out of the car. The keys Patricia had given me felt heavy in my hand as I approached the front porch, testing each step carefully before putting my full weight on it. 3 of the boards cracked under my feet, and I had to jump back to avoid falling through. I eventually made my way to the front door, a solid oak thing that had somehow survived better than the rest of the house. The key turned in the lock with some effort, and the door swung open with a horror movie creak that echoed through the empty house. The smell hit me first, musty, damp, with undertones of rot and animal droppings. I covered my nose and stepped inside, shining my flashlight around what had been the living room. Furniture sat under thick layers of dust and cobwebs. An old couch, a rocking chair, a coffee table with ancient magazines still scattered on top. Family photos hung crooked on the walls, their glass fronts cloudy with age. It was like stepping into a time capsule, except this capsule had been left to decay for 15 years. I walked through the house carefully, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The kitchen still had dishes in the sink, dried and cracked. The bedrooms upstairs were in slightly better condition, protected somewhat from the weather, though water damage stained the ceilings and walls. In what must have been Theodore's bedroom, I found more photos on a dresser. Pictures of him as a young man, strong and smiling, standing in front of this very house when it was new and beautiful. Pictures of crops growing in neat rows. Pictures of him with people I didn't recognize, probably friends or neighbors from decades ago. Looking at those photos, seeing the pride and joy in his face, made me sad. This place had meant something to him once. It had been his dream, his life's work, and now it was just ruins. As I explored the house, I noticed something odd. There were scratches on one of the bedroom doors, like something had been clawing at it from the inside. And in the hallway I found a door I hadn't noticed at first, painted the same color as the wall. It was locked, and none of the keys Patricia had given me seemed to fit. I jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Strange. Why would there be a locked door inside the house? I made a mental note to ask Patricia about it later, and continued my inspection. The bathroom was a nightmare of mold and broken fixtures. The second floor seemed structurally unsound in places, and I decided not to push my luck by exploring too thoroughly. When I came back downstairs, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the broken windows. I stood in the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of my great-uncle's life, and felt completely overwhelmed. What was I supposed to do with all this? I wasn't a carpenter. I wasn't a farmer. I was an accountant who just lost his job, and apparently lost his mind too, because why else would I be standing in an abandoned farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, trying to figure out how to salvage a property that was probably beyond saving? I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal to call my mom and tell her what I'd gotten myself into, but of course, there was nothing. No signal, no connection to the outside world. Just me, this crumbling house, and 78 acres of mountains and memories. Hey, if you're enjoying Christopher's journey so far, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. We share real stories about life change and finding hope in unexpected places. And I'm curious, have you ever had a moment where everything seemed to fall apart, only to open a door to something completely new? Drop a comment below and share your experience. Sometimes the best wisdom comes from each other's stories, and I read every single comment. Now let's see what Christopher discovers next in this mysterious old farmhouse. I decided to spend the night in my car rather than risk sleeping in that decrepit house. I parked near what used to be the front yard, reclined my seat as far as it would go, and wrapped myself in the emergency blanket I kept in my trunk. It wasn't comfortable, but at least I felt safe. As I lay there, staring up at more stars than I'd ever seen in Chicago, I thought about my great-uncle Theodore. What had driven him to leave this place? Why had he let it fall into such ruin? And why, of all people, had he left it to me, someone he barely knew? Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds. The rustling of wind through the overgrown trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the creaking of the old barn as it settled. Once, around 3 in the morning, I woke to what sounded like footsteps on the porch, but when I sat up and looked, there was nothing there, just shadows and moonlight playing tricks on my exhausted mind. When dawn finally broke, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to give up on this place, not yet. Maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe I was just too proud to admit defeat. But something about this property, despite its condition, felt like it was supposed to be mine. I drove back into Asheville that morning and found a hardware store. I bought work gloves, a crowbar, garbage bags, a better flashlight, some basic tools, and a sledgehammer. If I was going to make any progress on this place, I needed to start somewhere, and that somewhere was going to be clearing out the junk and assessing what could actually be salvaged. The clerk, an older gentleman named Ray with a thick mountain accent, asked me what I was working on. When I told him about the Jefferson property, his eyebrows shot up. "Old Theodore's place," he said, shaking his head. "Lord, I haven't thought about that farm in years. Your uncle was a good man. Shame what happened." I asked him what he meant, but he just gave me a sad smile and said, "He'll tell you himself if he wants you to know," and then changed the subject to which type of nails I'd need. Back at the farm, I spent the entire day working. I started with the porch, tearing off the boards that were completely rotted and making a pile of salvageable wood. It was hard, physical labor, the kind I wasn't used to after years behind a desk, and by noon my hands were blistered despite the gloves, but there was something satisfying about it too, something real. I was actually doing something, making visible progress, even if that progress was just creating organized piles of trash. I found all sorts of things as I worked. Old tools rusted beyond use, a child's toy truck faded and missing wheels, newspapers from 1997, the year before Theodore apparently stopped maintaining the property. Each item felt like a clue to a story I didn't fully understand. As the afternoon wore on, I moved inside and started clearing out the living room. I dragged furniture onto the porch, coughing from the dust and trying not to think about what kind of critters might be living in the cushions. I filled bag after bag with trash, old mail, broken dishes, rotted curtains. It was disgusting work, but underneath all the decay I started to see the bones of what had been a beautiful home. The hardwood floors, though damaged, were solid oak. The stone fireplace was still intact. The crown molding and woodwork showed craftsmanship you didn't see in modern construction. This house had been built to last, and despite 15 years of neglect, it was still standing. Around 4 in the afternoon, as I was hauling another load of trash out to the growing pile in the yard, I heard a truck coming up the driveway. I tensed, suddenly aware of how isolated I was out here. But the truck that emerged from the tree line was a battered red pickup with Henderson Contracting painted on the side. A man in his mid-50s climbed out, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. He introduced himself as James Henderson, Patricia's husband and a local contractor. "She mentioned you might need some help out here," he said, looking around at the property with an experienced eye. "Thought I'd stop by and see what you're dealing with." I gave James a tour of the property, showing him the damaged roof, the sagging porch, the barn that looked like a strong wind might finally knock it over. He took notes, examined support beams, tested floor joists, and asked me questions about what I wanted to do with the place. Honestly, I told him, I have no idea. I'm an accountant from Chicago. I don't know anything about farms or fixing up old houses. I just know I can't afford to walk away from 78 acres of land, and something tells me I'm supposed to be here. James nodded thoughtfully, like that made perfect sense to him. "Well," he said, "the house is in rough shape, but it's not beyond saving. The foundation is solid. Most of the damage is cosmetic or water-related. The roof is your biggest priority. That needs to be fixed before winter, or you'll lose the whole second floor. After that, we can work on the rest." He gave me a rough estimate that made my heart sink. Even doing a lot of the labor myself, getting the house weatherproof and livable was going to cost more than my entire severance package. James must have seen the disappointment on my face because he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Tell you what, I knew your uncle. He was a good man, helped my family out when we needed it. I'll work with you on the cost, and we can do it in phases so you're not hit with everything at once. You do what you can yourself, and I'll help with the technical stuff. We'll get this place fixed up." His kindness caught me off guard, and I had to blink back unexpected tears. I'd been so used to the cold, transactional nature of life in the city that simple human generosity felt almost foreign. That evening, after James left with a promise to come back the next day to start on the roof, I found myself drawn back to that locked door I'd discovered the day before. It bothered me, not knowing what was behind it. I examined it more carefully in the fading light and realized it wasn't actually a door to another room. It was a door leading down, a basement entrance. I tried all the keys again, then resorted to using my crowbar. The lock was old and rusty, and after some effort it gave way with a satisfying crack. The door swung open, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. A smell wafted up, not the musty decay I'd expected, but something else, something that smelled like oil and metal and old paper. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully made my way down the stairs, testing each step before putting my weight on it. The basement was surprisingly dry, much drier than I'd expected given the condition of the rest of the house. As my flashlight beam swept across the space, I froze. The basement wasn't empty. It wasn't some forgotten storage area filled with junk. It was a workshop, a very deliberate, very organized workshop. Workbenches lined the walls covered with tools that looked well maintained despite the years, but that wasn't what made me stop breathing. What made my heart race was what sat in the center of the room, covered with a tarp that I slowly pulled back. Under that tarp was a truck, not just any truck, but a fully restored 1952 Chevrolet pickup, gleaming red with chrome details that caught the light from my flashlight like jewels. I ran my hand along the hood, leaving a trail in the thin layer of dust, and stared in disbelief. The truck was immaculate, perfect. How had it survived down here in such pristine condition while everything above ground fell apart? I walked around it slowly, taking in every detail. The white wall tires still had air in them. The leather bench seat inside looked supple and cared for. The engine, when I popped the hood, was clean and organized, every part labeled and maintained. This truck had been someone's pride and joy, lovingly restored, and then hidden away down here like a treasure. But the truck wasn't the only thing in the basement. As I explored further, my flashlight revealed shelves lined with notebooks, dozens of them, all neatly organized by date. I pulled one down at random and opened it. The pages were filled with my great-uncle's handwriting, small and precise. They were journals, I realized. Records of his life, his work on the farm, his thoughts and dreams. I flipped through several, seeing entries about planting schedules, weather patterns, repairs he'd made to the house. But there were personal entries too, ones about loneliness, about missing his wife Eleanor, who'd apparently died in 1989, about his struggle to keep the farm going alone after she was gone. I sat down on an old stool near the workbench and started reading more carefully, piecing together the story of Theodore Jefferson's life. He and Eleanor had bought this property in 1961, right after they got married. They'd built their dream here, starting with nothing but raw land and determination. They grew vegetables, raised chickens and goats, sold their produce at farmers' markets in Asheville. They were happy. The entries from those early years radiated joy and contentment. Theodore wrote about watching sunrises with Eleanor, about teaching her to drive the tractor, about their plans to eventually have children and build a legacy. But the children never came. Entry after entry documented their struggles with infertility, the doctors they saw, the hope that slowly faded into acceptance. They poured their love into the farm instead, treating it like the child they couldn't have. And for a while, that seemed to be enough. Then in the spring of 1989, everything changed. Eleanor had a stroke while working in the garden. Theodore found her there, rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. She died 3 days later, and his world collapsed. The entries after her death were heartbreaking. Short, fragmented thoughts about how empty the house felt, how he couldn't bear to look at the garden she'd tended, how every morning he woke up reaching for her and found only empty space. He tried to keep the farm going. The journals showed that. He kept planting, kept harvesting, kept going through the motions, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The entries became less frequent, sometimes weeks or months between them. And then, in 1998, I found the entry that explained everything. "I can't do this anymore," Theodore had written. "Every corner of this place reminds me of her. The kitchen where she sang while cooking, the porch where we sat in the evenings, the bedroom where we planned our future. I've decided to move into town, into the assisted living facility on Maple Street. I can't bear to sell this place. It's all I have left of our dreams together, but I can't live here either. Maybe someday someone will love this farm the way we did. Maybe someday it will be a home again." I sat there in that basement, surrounded by the preserved memories of two people I'd never really known, and cried. I cried for Theodore and Eleanor. I cried for the farm they'd built and lost. I cried for myself and the life I'd lost in Chicago. And I cried because I suddenly understood why Theodore had left this place to me. I pulled out another journal, this one from much later, dated just 2 years ago. The entries were shakier, written by an elderly hand, but the words were clear. "I learned today that my great-nephew Christopher exists, Margaret's grandson. I met him once at a family reunion when he was just a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was kind to an old man he didn't know, asked me questions about my life, listened when I talked about the farm. Most of the family had written me off by then, the crazy hermit who lived in the mountains. But this boy, Christopher, he saw me, really saw me." The entry continued. "I've been thinking about what will happen to the farm when I'm gone. I have no children, no close family. The land will probably be sold, divided up, turned into vacation properties for wealthy people from the city. But maybe if I leave it to Christopher, something different could happen. Maybe he'll see what Eleanor and I saw here. Maybe he'll understand that this place isn't just land and buildings. It's possibility. It's a chance to build something real, something lasting. I don't know if he'll want it. He has his own life, his own dreams. But I have to try. I have to believe that someone might love this place again." I closed the journal and sat in silence, overwhelmed by the weight of what I'd just discovered. Theodore hadn't left me this farm because we were close. He'd left it to me because of one brief interaction decades ago, and because he believed, hoped, that I might be the person to bring it back to life. It was a tremendous act of faith from a man who'd lost everything he loved. And sitting there in his workshop, surrounded by the evidence of his careful preservation of the things that mattered most to him, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about fixing up a property. This wasn't about having a place to live or a fresh start. This was about honoring a legacy, about taking the broken pieces of what Theodore and Eleanor had built and making them whole again. I spent the rest of that evening in the basement, reading through more journals, learning about the farm's history. Theodore had documented everything: where the best soil was for tomatoes, which parts of the property flooded in heavy rain, how to maintain the well that provided water to the house, the names of neighbors who might be willing to help, contact information for the feed store, the equipment rental place, the county agricultural extension office. He'd left me not just a property, but a manual for how to run it, a gift from beyond the grave showing me that he really had believed I could do this. When I finally climbed those basement stairs, it was nearly midnight. I carefully locked the door behind me, though this time not to keep people out but to protect what was inside. That truck, those journals, they were precious. They were the heart of this place. I walked outside into the cool mountain air and looked at the farmhouse with new eyes. Yes, it was damaged. Yes, it needed an enormous amount of work, but it was also filled with love and history and purpose. And for the first time since I'd been fired from my job in Chicago, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt hope. The next morning, I woke up in my car with the sun streaming through the windshield and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going back to Chicago. I wasn't going to look for another accounting job, sitting in another cubicle, working for another company that would discard me the moment it became convenient. I was staying here. I was going to restore this farm. I was going to honor what Theodore and Eleanor had built. It was crazy. It was impractical. It was probably the worst financial decision I could make, but it felt right in a way nothing else had in a very long time. James Henderson showed up around 8 o'clock with his crew and a truck full of roofing materials. Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me. I hired James to handle the roof and the major structural repairs, but everything else I did myself. I watched YouTube videos on my phone when I could get signal in town, learning how to replace broken windows, patch drywall, refinish hardwood floors. I made countless trips to the hardware store, where Ray started giving me a discount and free advice. The locals began to recognize me, this city guy who'd inherited old Theodore's place and was crazy enough to try to bring it back. The physical labor was exhausting but therapeutic. Every board I replaced, every wall I patched, every surface I cleaned felt like an act of redemption. I was rebuilding more than just a house. I was rebuilding myself. The anger and hurt from losing my job began to fade, replaced by calluses on my hands and a growing sense of accomplishment. I started sleeping in the house once the roof was fixed, and I'd cleared out one of the bedrooms upstairs. It wasn't comfortable yet. I was sleeping on an air mattress with a camping lantern for light, but it was mine. Every night I'd sit on the newly repaired front porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, and every night I felt a little more at peace. About 2 months into the restoration, I decided it was time to deal with the truck in the basement. I'd been avoiding it, almost afraid to touch something so perfect when everything else was still in various stages of disrepair. But Theodore hadn't restored that truck just to have it sit in a basement forever. He'd meant for it to be driven, to be useful, to be part of the farm's life again. I spent a week getting it ready, changing the fluids, checking all the systems, making sure everything was still in working order. When I finally turned the key and heard that engine roar to life, echoing through the basement, I couldn't help but laugh with pure joy. I built a ramp and carefully drove that beautiful truck up into the daylight for the first time in who knows how many years. It handled perfectly, smooth and powerful, a testament to Theodore's mechanical skills. I used it to haul materials from the hardware store, to clear brush from the overgrown fields, to do all the work a farm truck is meant to do. And every time I drove it, I felt connected to my great-uncle in a way I never had when he was alive. This truck was his legacy, and now it was helping me build mine. As winter approached, I began to think seriously about what I was going to do with the land itself. I'd been so focused on the house and buildings that I hadn't really considered the farming aspect. But sitting in Theodore's workshop one evening, reading his journals by lamplight, I found my answer. Eleanor had been passionate about heirloom vegetables, varieties that were being lost to commercial agriculture. She'd saved seeds, traded with other gardeners, maintained strains that had been passed down through families for generations. In the basement, sealed in mason jars and carefully labeled, I found her seed collection, hundreds of varieties, some dating back decades, preserved and waiting. I knew what I had to do. Come spring, I was going to plant Eleanor's garden again. I was going to grow the vegetables she'd loved, the tomatoes and beans and squash that she'd tended with such care. I didn't know if the seeds would still be viable after all these years, but I had to try. It felt like the right way to honor both of them, to bring their dream back to life in a tangible, growing, living way. I started preparing, reading books about seed starting and organic farming, planning where each crop would go, based on Theodore's detailed notes about sun exposure and soil conditions. Christmas came and went quietly. My mom and sister drove down from Chicago to visit, and I gave them the full tour of the property. My mom cried when she saw how much progress I'd made, and again when I showed her the journals, and explained why Theodore had left the farm to me. My sister, always the practical one, asked if I was sure about this, if I really wanted to give up my career for such an uncertain future. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. The person I'd been in Chicago, stressed and unfulfilled and chasing someone else's definition of success, that person was gone. The man I was becoming here, working with my hands and the land, connected to family and history and purpose, that was who I was meant to be. By the time spring arrived, the farmhouse was transformed. It still needed work. It would probably always need work, but it was beautiful and livable and filled with warmth. I'd refinished the floors, replaced all the windows, rebuilt the porch, painted the exterior a crisp white with dark green shutters, just like in the old photos of Theodore and Eleanor. I'd restored the kitchen, keeping as many of the original features as I could while making it functional. The stone fireplace in the living room worked again, and I'd spent many cold winter nights in front of it, reading and planning and dreaming about the future. On a warm day in late March, I planted Eleanor's seeds. I'd prepared the soil carefully, following Theodore's instructions about composting and crop rotation. As I pressed each seed into the earth, I said a quiet prayer that they would grow, that some small part of what Eleanor had preserved would come back to life. And over the following weeks, as tiny green shoots began to push up through the soil, I felt like I was witnessing a miracle. These plants, grown from seeds saved decades ago by a woman I'd never met, were proof that love and care and dedication could transcend time. They were proof that broken things could be restored. They were proof that endings could become beginnings. Standing in that garden on a sunny May morning, surrounded by rows of growing vegetables and the sound of birds in the trees, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Getting fired had felt like the end of my world, but it had actually been the beginning of something so much better. I'd found purpose, I'd found peace, I'd found a home, and I'd learned that sometimes the things we think we've lost are just making room for the things we're meant to find. If this story touched your heart, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel and become part of this community. We're all on journeys of transformation, finding hope in unexpected places, and learning that sometimes life's biggest setbacks are actually setups for something beautiful. I'd love to hear your story too. Have you ever had a moment where losing something led you to find exactly what you needed? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And before you go, I'm curious, what's the biggest lesson you're taking away from Christopher's journey? Drop a comment and let me know. This community thrives on the wisdom we share with each other, and I read every single message. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the best chapters of our lives are the ones we never saw coming.